Hi, today we're going to be talking about organizational structure. And this is really a key place for us to start when we're talking about financial management because the type of organization you are influences a lot of the financial decisions and processes you go through. So let's get started. Um, we generally talk about three different types of organization, and they are commercial, sometimes referred to as private, but these are your for-profit companies. Not for-profit, sometimes referred to as non-profit, and I'll talk a little bit about that distinguishment in language, and then a public agency or a government agency. So when we talk about commercial organizations, and again, these are your for-profit companies, even within that, there are three subcategories. One is private, and this is an organization that's held by one or a handful of people, oftentimes that the founder or the founders. So examples of companies in this space that are Parks and Rec oriented: Toys R Us, Enterprise Rent-A-Car, Aramark, Amway, and Hilton. The second type is public or publicly traded, and this gets a little bit confusing because we also say public with government, but this is really publicly traded. So these are for-profit companies that sell stock. So anybody, the public, can own a piece of this company by purchasing stock through the stock exchange. Examples include Google, Facebook, Coca-Cola, Walmart, Dick's Sporting Goods, and Marriott. The final one, which is rare, but I mentioned because one of these organizations is a big company in our industry, and that's a co-op. This is a for-profit company, but it's owned by its customers. So if you shop at REI and you bought a membership at REI, you are now part owner of REI. And you may realize that when every year you basically get a share of the profits to spend back in the store. So not-for-profit organizations do not generate profits for the purpose of making anyone richer. And this is an important distinction. You can make money in a not-for-profit organization. It's just not the purpose, and it doesn't get distributed to the owners or the shareholders. It's basically for sustainability. This is why I like the term not-for-profit rather than non-profit. I just think it's a clear distinction, but both terms are certainly relevant and accurate. So these exist for the public good. They meet a specific need. They're created through enabling legislation. So government legislation allows the existence of nonprofits and then designation of tax status, which is through the IRS. They're often human service, so they're assessing a developmental need. And for us, oftentimes that's recreation, education, anything along that lines. They're generally tax exempt, which means the organization does not have to pay taxes. And within the nonprofit world, there are actually various types of tax status, IRS designated status. The most common one is 501c3. The important thing to know about that is not only is the organization tax exempt, but if you give money to a 501c3 organization, that money you gave, you can actually write off your taxes as well. A 501c4 or C7, which are both fairly common in recreation as well, do not pay taxes, but donations to them are not tax deductible, so that's the distinction there. So examples of not-for-profit organizations include Tennis on the Hill, Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCA's, Sierra Club, United States Tennis Association, Wasatch Community Gardens, tons more within our field. And then finally, public or government organizations, and this is quite simply an arm of the government. So this would be like Salt Lake County Parks and Rec or Salt Lake City Parks and Rec, the National Park Service, Utah Public Lands. All of these are government agencies. So lots of different questions we can answer / ask when talking about the different types of organizations. One, who is your customer and who is your competition? And as you're hopefully taking notes on this lecture, I might recommend just creating a little chart. And you can do these different categories. So a category would be customer, and a category would be competition, and that way you can nicely compare each of the three. So commercial, your customer is basically whoever can pay. You really don't care. If they can afford your service, that's who you want. It's defined by your business goals, and you're competitive with whoever is in your space. You want money. You want to make a profit. This is your ultimate goal. A not-for-profit, the customer is determined by the need, by the social situation you're trying to address. So if you're trying to address recreation for underserved youth, then your customer is obviously underserved youth or families in the case of the YMCA, for example. Your competition could be from any of these spaces. It could be a for-profit company, it could be another not-for-profit, or it could be a government agency. Excuse me. If you're a public government agency, your customer is in a specific geographic area or a constituency. So it could be Salt Lake County or Salt Lake City, the state of Utah, depending on the level of government. So your customer is potentially everyone within that geographic area. It doesn't mean practically that everyone becomes your customer, but potentially it is. And again, your competition can come from any of the three org types: commercial, not-for-profit, or public. And I think this is fairly unique to our industry in parks, recreation, and tourism, is that we do get organizations that exist in all three of these types. So how do you measure success? So if you're doing a chart along with us, then success would be your next category. For a commercial for-profit company, it's quite simple. You measure success by your profit margins. I have worked in commercial agencies, not-for-profits, and public, and I often tell people that commercials are the easiest to work in because you have one goal: make money, and that is all that counts. That is how you measure success. A not-for-profit, on the other hand, you're really trying to address a social need. You're trying to meet that mission. This is all about your mission. So this is what your success is about. But ultimately, to meet that mission, you have to maintain financial viability as well. You have to continue to exist. To do that, you have to have your finances in order. So you actually end up addressing two different measures of success. And then if we look at public agencies, we use the term public good. So you're meeting the needs and desires of your constituents, which can be very, very challenging because your constituents have lots of different needs and desires, and sometimes they are competing. So you have to decide which of those you're addressing. And I mentioned this term, the balanced scorecard, because it's an often used tool in public agencies and something I think it's worth being familiar with. And it's basically saying, and you're looking at 4 different measures of success. Financial, so you have to still have some financial viability. Your internal processes, learning and growth. This is about employees and your organization, and then your customers. So I mentioned that briefly, just as something if you hear, you might want to kind of follow that in the back of your brain. So what is your financial organizational structure? Before I talk about that, just some terminology about different financial positions. CFO, or Chief Financial Officer, Director of Finance, Controller, Comptroller, Treasurer, Assessor, Purchasing Agent, Auditor. These are common financially oriented jobs. One I want to point out here is the assessor. Assessor is unique to a government agency, and this is the person who goes out and determines what property is worth in order to tax it. Okay. For a commercial organization, so this is your for-profits, you have an owner, and then everyone else ultimately reports to that owner. The owner may be president, CEO, they may not. It just depends. The one subtle difference here is if it's a publicly traded commercial organization, then the owner is actually the shareholders, who elects a board of directors, who then elects or hires, a president, CEO, who then hires the other positions. If you're in a government agency, public, there's an elected governing body. That may be a city council, that may be a mayor. That person generally, or that body, will appoint a general manager, hire a general manager, and that goes by different titles: city manager, county manager, general manager, operations manager, I've heard. That individual reports to the elected governing body, and then that individual is ultimately responsible for hiring all other employees. In terms of finances, you'll often have an outside auditor come in. You may have a treasurer as well. A treasurer is sometimes an elected position in public agencies, which gets a little tricky. If you're interested in Salt Lake City, here's the organizational chart for Salt Lake City. It's a little difficult to see, but we have the mayor here, and the mayor hires chief of staff. I mentioned there's lots of different terms. Chief of staff, and the chief of staff hires the heads of all these other departments. So where are we in here? Department of Community and Economic Development, Department of Public Services, Parks and Rec could exist in often either of those. Salt Lake's a little unique with the way its library functions, but we don't get into that. It is actually kind of an odd setup. A not-for-profit organization is governed by a board of directors, almost always volunteer. Occasionally they'll be paid a minor fee, but they almost always volunteer. Similar to other organizations, that board of directors hires an executive director who then hires other employees. Depending on the size of the organization, of course, you certainly have small organizations where the board of directors does all the work. Ideally, they are hiring an outside auditor to come in and check their finances periodically just to make sure everything is in order. And then finally, how do you report your finances? For a commercial for-profit agency, if you were private, it just goes straight to the IRS. No one else has any rights to see your financial information. If you are publicly traded, so if you're selling stock, it goes to the IRS, to your shareholders, and it is publicly available. You can go on the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission website, and I can look up the finances for Coke, Facebook, Target, any of those publicly traded companies. A not-for-profit organization to the IRS, of course, and these are also publicly available. They're called Form 990s. You can call up any not-for-profit organization and request those, and they're required to give them to you. There's also a website called GuideStar, which collects a lot of these, so you can find them there. And then, of course, a public government agency, usually you can find that on the web, but you can also call and ask, and they will give that to you. And that concludes our brief overview of organizational structure. As I mentioned, this can have a lot of influence in not just financials, but in the work environment, and I would encourage you to kind of think through that as you continue through your next lesson. Have a great day.